Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Wingcoat Audubon Society's monthly program. My name is Kevin Roth. I am the program chair on the board of directors for the Wingcoat Audubon Society. I'm also a Pennsylvania master naturalist, and I also work at the Pennypack Ecological Restoration Trust, which is where we're hosting live tonight. I'm actually presenting for my boss, who is the executive director of the Pennypack Ecological Restoration Trust. Chris is a landscape architect who has practiced for the last 15 years with firms that specialize in ecologically informed place-based design. Chris was a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer, serving as a natural resource management volunteer in a wildlife sanctuary in Thailand, not far from the Mekong River in the late 1990s. He holds a Master of Landscape Architecture from the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, and a Bachelor's in Environmental Studies from the University of Buffalo. So now I present Foundational Ecosystem Support for Birds from the Executive Director of the Pennypack Trust, Chirs Mendel.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I cannot share my screen right now. It looks like somebody else is sharing.
Oh, 1 second here.
Yeah, and while we fix this little glitch here, I'll say I come from Buffalo, New York, of all places, and went to the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry based out of Syracuse, New York. Got my undergraduate out of Syracuse, New York. I got a master's degree in landscape architecture and an undergraduate in environmental studies from the University at Buffalo. Buffalo played a pretty fundamental role in how I became a landscape architect and a conservationist, really being drawn to industrial landscapes, recovering from their industrial legacy, but also having a wealth of beautiful architectural and landscape architectural gems surrounding Buffalo, from Frank Lloyd Wright to H.H. Richardson, and of course, Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed the park system for Buffalo, New York in the late 1870s and 1880s. So I see from the chat that we've got people from Ripon, California, and I believe I saw Edmonton, Alberta. So it's great to see that we've got a wide diversity of folks who are going to be following this intensely local story here. So we're going to spend a few minutes talking about what is the Pennypack Ecological Restoration Trust and what is the context around the trust, because context is everything. And as we talk about ecological restoration, we also need to talk about what are we restoring from? What has that landscape, how has it evolved? How has it been disturbed? And that is fundamental to how we reestablish ecosystem services, and in this case, foundational ecosystem support for birds. Those of you who are in it for the birds tonight, I think what I'm going to do is provide some context to what supports bird life and how it is that we try and do our best to play host to birds, particularly migratory songbirds here, but you'll see others as well. So for some regional context, here's a recent aerial photograph of the Philadelphia metropolitan region. And this green lightning bolt, if you will, that's cutting right through all of that urban growth is the Pennypack Watershed. It's a creek that drains to the Delaware River, and that is that large river there that of course drains southern parts of New York State, a good half of New Jersey, the eastern portion of Pennsylvania, and on down to Maryland. The Philadelphia as a metropolitan region is also bounded by the Schuylkill River that you see here to the left, noted by the Schuylkill Expressway on the 76. But our little Ecological Restoration Trust is in this trapezoidal pocket up here at the top, bounded by yet another highway. This, in this case, is I-276. So we at the Pennypack Trust own 276 contiguous acres. Did I just say that? 725 contiguous acres along 4 miles of the Pennypack Creek inside that trapezoid. And we help our neighbors conserve another 133 acres. As of next week, it'll be 134 acres, 144 acres, where we have purchased the development rights from that land, and we're here to ensure that development will never happen on that land. What you're looking at here is a Google Earth axonometric image of our landscapes. And as you can see, it's a mosaic of landscape or habitat types. And you see grasslands, you also see horse pasture right there in the foreground, quite a bit of forest that is maturing. That is essentially the floodplain and upper reaches or upper portions of the creek coming out of that valley. But you'll also see that there's remnants of estate landscapes out there to the right. You'll see that there's a church grounds to the far north, and I'll show you some historic images of that. What is essentially a carnival field out here to the left, a golf course. There's an awful lot of suburbia that surrounds this place. We are essentially an island of habitat that is surrounded by all these different types of disturbances and very human-centric uses. And we have this gentleman to thank for the majority of the formation of the Pennypack Ecological Restoration Trust. He passed away less than a year ago. His name is Feo Pitcairn. Just a fantastic gentleman who ran the family business for some time, but really established this place as a watershed association, and then its migration into a land trust through the 80s and 90s. He's also a world-renowned photographer and filmmaker, and he spent an awful lot of time photographing the Pennypack Trust and its various natural conditions. And you'll see some of that work in here today. And he is a vehicle for providing some historical context to where we are. This is actually where Feo grew up. This is the Lord's New Church. It was the church complex that I showed you at the very top of the screen of that axonometric. This is probably taken in the mid-1940s. And this is an idealized version of the type of agriculture that has been happening here since 1750. So most of this area is recovering from intense agriculture, as well as milling and firewood production and forest uses. I'll show you examples of that in a second. But Feo grew up in this idealized context, very close to the animals that his father and mother raised here in that beautiful barn complex you just saw. And here's another example of the landscapes of the Pennypack Trust, probably from around 1900, maybe 1905. Those beautiful percherons are about to drag out that, 150 years of sycamore life on that carriage behind it. So even the woodlands have been very highly utilized for that 250 years. That tree is on its way, no doubt, to become a beam or a joist or a rafter somewhere here in Huntington Valley. So one of my favorite things about this picture is that it illustrates where we're coming from. What are we recovering from, and what are the maison plantes that we're going to make this restoration into a set of forests and grasslands from. That building that you see there in the background is the building that Kevin and I are in at headquarters of the Pennypack Trust. This picture taken, no doubt, in the depths of January or February of 1945. And what I want to point out here especially is these little wisps that happen in a rhythm as they approach the camera lens. You can see those wisps that I'm trying to put my cursor on here. And those wisps, about 70 to 80 years later, have become those now mature maples that you see marching down that same driveway that the camera was on. And it is highly illustrative of the kind of change that this landscape is capable of. With just the right amount of guidance and nurturing, we can return to a forest-like or scrubland condition, so long as we can make sure that we're planting the next generation of trees and of shrubs or of grasses, and we're doing the right things with regard to management of invasive species, not using too much herbicide, et cetera, to try and guide that area, to try and guide that forest recovery. In a similar way, and what was in the foreground of that axon, which was the second slide, is a farmland that had been used right up to the 1980s, although haltingly. This is a picture of that farmland that has now been restored to a warm season grassland. And in fact, the guy who did that restoration and guided that restoration, David Robertson, is on this meeting today. And that restoration occurred in the late 90s, and its young, fragile life emerging in the early 2000s, again, as a warm season grassland. But as you all know, as birders, it is grassland that is one of the most important habitats for migratory songbirds in this part of the eastern seaboard, the Piedmont. And so that is one of the reasons why this wasn't converted just to forest. It is a wonderful patch of 130 acres of grasslands that is immediately adjacent to that recovering forest. And it's that pairing of forest and grassland that also helps to make it so important for birds. And here's a shot of that recovering forest landscape. Now here in the 2000s, we can say that we have mature tulip poplar forest stands with some understory in some locations. But these landscapes are coming along with or without dense populations of white-tailed deer. It is one of the most influential forces on the trajectory of this landscape and what it is capable of nurturing. These deer and their overabundance are why we must plant at least 800 trees every year so that we can leapfrog those really sensitive moments in a tree's and a sapling's life when they are most likely to be chewed to nothing by those animals. And if it weren't for that, we would have a stagnating forest landscape. So this is, in essence, while we call this ecological restoration, it is essentially ecological gardening. It is still a landscape that is still dominated by a heavy hand of man. But it is, I don't mean to cast a negative aspersion about how much effort goes into this. It comes with results. We have turkey, American turkey here that regularly go, I mean, daily, nightly go between those fields and those forests. And they're doing surprisingly well in this suburban area. We now have beaver marching down the corridor that is the Pennypack Creek. And those beaver are helping to improve wildlife habitat, particularly for amphibians and for fish. But it is the idea and the ideal of plant communities as a whole and nurturing those plant communities that is, I think, most important to us and has been generationally since the beginning of the Watershed Association and the Pennypack Trust. Thinking about whole systems and starting from the ground up, starting from the foundations of where we transfer energy and biomass out of sunlight and soil and water and into plants, right? This is where you begin ecological restoration in this part of the world. And all of this is to say that this is not an aside. It's not a little project undertaken by a nature preserve or by a land trust whose main focus is to preserve land or to preserve cultural landscapes. On the contrary, what we do here is to forever support natural landscapes populated by native plants and animal life. My own personal and professional bias on this is that we're here to nurture these landscapes for species other than our own, to favor them and their conditions, and then carefully invite humans to enjoy this landscape too with restrictions. We're placing nature first and trying as best we can to do what we can with this very limited acreage. And we're going to talk about those limits in just a second. So we started a project here about 2 years ago where we were thinking about what can we do to make ourselves less of an island, or maybe the better way to put it, what can we do to make ourselves a larger island that can be useful to wildlife, in particular to migratory birds. And what we notice is that our neighbors around us, and I should also modify that and say, what can we do to improve the size and the quality of that island without a huge outlay of cash and the need to manage all of that extra new land, because that is a serious limiting factor when you're running a nature preserve and a land trust. So the answer that we have come up with and are now pursuing is to look at all of our neighbors who have a tremendous amount of lawn, essentially just turf areas that are used for, in some cases, once or twice a year, or they're used for concerts, or they're just used for idyllic views. They are cultural landscapes, first and foremost. And most people in these neighborhoods can appreciate them as cultural landscapes and not necessarily as ecological infrastructure. And I think, as we all know, few people look at landscapes as ecological infrastructure. And that is something we're trying to tackle here. So our project is to look at some of our near neighbors, engage with them, and say, what can we do to help you change your mind about grass, about turf, and let it go for a little bit and see if that lack of disturbance can usher a change, again, from the bottom up, from the soils to the plants, to the bugs, and ultimately to the birds, so that we can expand the ecological uplift of this area. So again, the main points were to look at large landowners first and have discrete conversations with those folks and help them at no cost. One of the things that I think the Pennypack Trust is ready, willing, and able to share at any time is our passion for making natural spaces healthy, or for simply making more spaces natural, and to help guide them in experimenting with their landscapes. What else can you get out of this landscape that might be essentially single purpose? It's meant to host a carnival for 3 days out of the year. Well, what's it going to do for the other 363 days out of the year? And how can we help you appreciate those other functions that it can perform? So essentially trying to take any kind of financial risk out of experimenting with their landscapes, and also give them some lenses for appreciating what that other value is. And if we can get those couple partners to trial that, then perhaps we could have them convince other neighbors to do the same. So this is, again, more than just a side project. This is something that could be a strategic ambition of ours for a very long time. So one of the first questions that we need to answer here, if we're asking people to change their turf areas to a grassland of sorts, is, well, what is a grassland anyway? And generally speaking, grasslands are made up of warm season grasses and cool season grasses, ideally intermixed with forbs or flowering plants. Not to say that grasses aren't flowering plants, but flowers that we would recognize from decorative purposes. Warm season grasses, a lot of Indian grass, a lot of panicum, and I'll show you an example of how they come up later in the season. They generally emerge April, May, but they're reaching heights of 3, 5, and 6 feet around July, August, September, where cool season grasses generally much smaller, lots of fescues, and they're emerging right at the beginning of spring and starting to turn brown in late June and July. And here's a really good example of that. This is a picture of the orchard, an agricultural relic that we have here at the Trust on the right, and intentionally planted warm season grasses on the left. And this picture is probably from July. I think it's the first week of July, maybe the last week of June. And the cool season grasses on the right, you can see they're about 2, maybe 3 feet high, and their seed heads are fully out and they're browning out. Meanwhile, on the left, the warm season grasses are just getting started. And in a few months, that grass is going to be well overhead, easily 7, 8, 9 feet overhead in patches. And it's a beautiful thing to see, really nice. But very different mixes of seeds, very different types of grasslands, but they are combined to make a turf grass. So that's why your grass on your lawn can stay green from April all the way to October, is because it's a blend of both cool and warm season grasses. But we want those grasses to grow more or less undisturbed, because we want those grasses to have a relationship with insects, particularly larval insects. And those of you who've been following Doug Tallamy, you all know now very well, and we really thank Doug Tallamy for beginning this movement of understanding the value of insects, particularly to songbirds. If it's not for larval insects, there is not sufficient protein for songbirds to grow clutches and to have those birds fledge and ultimately become adults. It is an essential foodstuff for them that cannot be made up of seed mixes or of simply, placing boxes in the right place. We've got to have this for birds to persist. So we also know that we're facing a crisis here. We know that insects are in crisis. Over 40% of all insect species are in decline and could die out in coming decades. Germany has witnessed a 75% decline in insect biomass just in the last 27 years. We are missing some of the most important elements to ecosystems as we watch this integral layer decline. We really have to address this. So the next couple slides are essentially our sales pitch to begin these relationships with those large landowners. And we also have to recognize that our large landowners are not members of Windcoat Audubon, right? They're not birders. They don't automatically assume a conservationist's mentality. So you have to come at them from different directions. And reduced mowing is one of those directions. Perform a little less maintenance on your landscape, save a little bit of money, and know that you're doing something good for the environment. Whether you understand that or not is another thing. And of course, we're here to help educate them if they're willing to listen. But reducing mowing is one of those angles, as well as soil retention. Making sure that we're not contributing to water pollution and that we're keeping that precious resource where it belongs, that's important. And people certainly understand nectar and pollen. They understand that you'd have to be in quite a closet not to hear the term pollinator gardens and pollinator this and that in most mass media circles. And of course, we're trying to educate them as to the importance of this as structure as well. I love this picture taken after a snowfall in December that shows how many birds are working what seed is left from still upright grasslands here at the Pennypack Trust. And that's, from a late morning walk. It's really getting worked as forage in the late winter, midwinter. There's one of those examples right there. We also have to educate our large landowners about how does one maintain this place. It's not that you just forget about it. It still needs to be mown. And so we looked into the economic possibilities for, whoops, and I think I took that slide out, sorry. Anyway, suffice to say, we needed to demonstrate to them that mowing your grasslands was something that was an agricultural product that could be sold on the market. Not that they would make an abundance of money, but that there would be some economic driver for farmers to become involved in the mowing of these places. Because if you let these grasslands grow for some time, pretty soon you're going to outstrip the ability of your equipment to maintain it, and you will need specialized equipment to do that, which is exactly what happens here at the Pennypack Trust. We were also pursuing money of our here to fund this effort. And so NIFWIF, which happens to be the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, regularly puts out millions of dollars in grants to perform conservation-related efforts and programs. In this case, and it happened to be in that year, NIFWIF had a list that said, if you're trying to improve habitat for any of these birds here, then you're going to be in the pipeline to receive funds from these grants. Unfortunately, and many of you diehard birders will know that trying to improve grasslands doesn't really account for those target species that NIFWIF had mentioned there. Golden winged warbler prefers scrubland. Cerulean warbler prefers riparian corridors, forested riparian corridors. Wood thrush is, the poster bird for forest interior nesting birds. And again, David Robertson has spent 26 years studying wood thrush populations and other forest interior nesting birds here at the Trust. And I'm hoping that we can hear from him on that effort in the future. So we thought, well, we need to target the species that we think that we could possibly bring here, such as willow flycatchers, such as bobolink. And in fact, when the warm season grasses were originally envisioned, it was one of the marks of success of that restoration would be the presence of nesting bobolink. And we have learned from birders that have helped us out in making this effort and evolving this effort that, quite frankly, there ain't no way we're going to get bobolinks or savanna or grasshopper sparrows to stay here, because we simply don't have scale. If we were to convert all of our acreage to cool season and warm season grasses and forego the forest, we might have a chance at doing that. But there's obviously no way that we would sacrifice that rich mosaic of forest and grassland and riparian conditions, and to some extent, some scrubland. That's working very well for a number of species, thank you very much. And the bobolink and grasshopper sparrows are going to have to go somewhere else where there are landscapes of scale that are suitable to them. So we realized in this effort that not all of our targets were appropriate. And maybe we shouldn't shoot for the third trophic layer above what we're actually trying to address here. Again, we're looking at foundational ecosystem support for birds. Well, that foundation is in the plant community, and that ability for the plant community to be host to insects. So I'm going to go through this very, very quickly, but we provided our potential clients with ideas of how cool season grasses would look in spring and in midsummer, early summer, and when they might be taken over by other forbs in the fall. Oh, there's that slide I was missing about potential products of warm and cool season grasses. So this is actually taken off. I'm pleased to announce that we do have some large landowner partners who are going to be contributing over 30 acres to these experiments. And we're going to have staff out there for the next several growing seasons trying to demonstrate that there has been an uptick in insect biomass and diversity as a result of reduced mowing and also synchronized mowing. That's another element here. Time is always an essential element in restoration practice, one in which we're not really talking about here. But we have been working on creating baseline data of insect life and plant life in many of these zones, and trying to steward this as a richer, better grassland may be one of our variables as we move forward with this. I'm hoping this is going to be a long-term commitment. Here's a look at one of our interns and also one of our intern entomologists who is now on staff here, who is providing some of this data and giving us the framework for being able to examine this year on year. And it's good to know, and part of the educational process, that we're looking at insect life that is dealing with already thriving in highly disturbed, regularly mown environments. And it's not just butterflies, it's not just quintessential pollinators like butterflies and wasps and bees, it's beetles and it's grubs, all kinds of other things that the entomologist certainly knows more about than I. We've also been able to take this show on the road, as it were, as young and, I don't want to say infantile, but certainly ever changing as it is, where, you know, it is one of those projects that we are building as we, what is the phrase? We're going to fly it as we build it, or build it as we fly it. It's always in motion. We were alerted to No Mow May as this thing taking over certain threads in social media. Very, very catchy phrase, No Mow May, something that started in the UK in 2019. And we immediately thought, well, this is a cool idea. It's certainly a catchy little phrase. But just getting people to ask the question, what happens if I don't mow so much? Should I mow as much as I do? That was the handle we wanted. But quite frankly, we noticed that the social media package that came with this kind of stuff usually had really beautiful illustrations of what could happen to your lawn if you stopped mowing, like this one. That is the background to this slide. That, well, quite frankly, that's not going to happen. If you stop mowing your grass, it's not going to show up like that. I can promise you. If you stop mowing your grass, it's going to turn to scrubland. Ultimately, it's going to get weedy. It might become completely overgrown with porcelainberry, or you might get interesting trees and shrubs as a result. But it's not going to become some beautiful flower meadow instantaneously. But again, we're trying to show people what will really happen and ask the question, should you mow as much as you do? And if you're not going to mow, when's the most important time to leave that lawn alone? So we run them through the same educational process as we started with the large landowners. Of course, you've seen all those slides before, educating them as to what is turf, what's already there in your landscape. You cannot assume that people know those things. And talk to them about mowing from an ecological perspective. Mowing is constant disturbance. And it can really set back plants who are interested in trying to set flower buds or to set seed heads. And that's an injury that they must recover from. And recovering from injury can be very water intensive. It can be very fertilizer intensive, just as one must feed a cold on their recovery from the common cold. It has function, certainly. It keeps those soft tissues of grasses dominant there and prohibits any kind of woody plants from growing in there so that you can make sure that you have lawn. There's a great illustration of that. There's porcelain berry trying to weave its way through those grasses. So it's not without function. And by the way, grasses are not without a way of responding to those disturbances. So oftentimes mowing will force species to reproduce asexually rather than sexually. As I just said, you're cutting off their flower heads, you're cutting off their seed dispersal mechanisms. So the only thing they have left now is reproducing rhizominously, which can make for what the lawn guys will tell you is a self-healing lawn. Well, that's a plant just trying to make it work and trying to set its next generation into those soils. It can also send a signal to some plants to dwarf, to set their seed heads quite a bit lower. This is a response that certainly predates the advent of a mower. This is a response that these plants have evolved because of browsing from deer or from other herbivores, right? But the substance of this presentation that we're really just starting to roll out, this is the first of a 3-piece educational series on no-mow May, or reducing your mowing, and how to do that in your neck of the woods. Let's talk about the value of this ecologically. How are plants, how can grasses be hosts to insects? And as I said before, everybody is talking about pollinator gardens and the need for pollinators. And that's, of course, a set of relationships and mechanisms based on the transfer of nectar and of pollen. And I think most people kind of reflexively think of these kinds of insect flower, insect plant relationships, but it's certainly not the only one. It's an important one. And here is a hint at that element of time. For those of you who know beekeeping, I'm a hobbyist beekeeper. You'll know that there's 2 seasons for putting on honey, because there's 2 seasons for a lot of nectar flow. And that's happening in May and June. And you'll put on pounds and pounds of honey if you're having a good spring. And then you'll go through this dip that's called the dearth. And then you'll have another nectar flow occurring in August and September, usually from goldenrod and asters and others. But there's that relationship writ large between plants and insects, particularly Apis mellifera. And it's important to have a diversity of flowers. Everybody knows that. Your rain gardens and bioswales and your flower gardens should have a diversity. And of course, there's cultural attributes to that too. But what about herbivory? What about simply letting your plants become food for that higher trophic level? Oftentimes, we're sold millions of dollars worth of herbicide, insecticide, to make sure that herbivory doesn't happen. And we are essentially staunching the flow of energy through our food chains every time we do that. So letting your plants become food, if you can stomach that, could be important. And of course, you can have specialists, you can have generalists. Anybody who grows tomato plants knows about the specialists that like their tomato plants, or their potatoes, or their broccoli, for instance. And there are predator relationships, right? There are guilds making a living simply through the complexity that's forming in your lawns that are not constantly being disturbed. There's predation happening there. There's structure for hunting. There are structures that they will produce, of course, for hunting. Again, why isn't that as important as pollination? Why this structure and complexity is every bit as important as those things. There's also scavenger and decomposer relationships. What's happening to that plant material as it dies off? We have those beautiful flowers for our visual enjoyment, or perhaps because we love the way they smell, and they're up for 2 to 3 weeks, maybe. What happens to those structures? Who's responsible for getting rid of it? It's these guys, right? That's, as well as fungi and others, but decomposition is an important role. We need to be cognizant of all the different roles that insects play for us. And finally, they're structures for the passage of time, for the persistence of the species. What are we doing to make sure that, obviously these bugs aren't getting through the winter. So we've got to make sure that there is structure for them, for their eggs to transition through that winter period and be there for the next year. Again, mowing is just putting all that in a blender on a regular basis. There's another lesson and another lecture about, how to manage your leaf litter that we haven't even begun to talk about here, nor have we really begun to experiment with at the Trust. Lots of literature elsewhere for that. So we talk about pollinators, but we don't often think that grasses are essential pieces of either structure or food sources for butterflies, for instance. And oftentimes butterflies, through their different life cycles, will need different structures and different habitats for each of their different life phases. So there are butterflies that need to have beech forest for their larval stages, and then they're going to need to be out in grasslands for their adult phases. That mosaic of landscapes is really important, and grasses play a role. And finally, this is the target that you guys are all interested in, and it is remarkable how fast they have grown into areas that we have simply let go. That orchard, for instance, that we showed you, that was browning out in early July. It was early June when red-winged blackbirds were literally placing nests inside those grasses. They had never done that before because we've always mown it, always. But there were multiple red-winged blackbird nests now perched inside the grasses, made of those grasses, and they were using the structure of the orchard trees as ways of observing their landscape and keeping predators away, or at least being away of egg predators. They were making it work simply because we'd stopped bothering them for a period of a few months. And I'm just gonna leave it here because that is the transition we're all about. That is the picture that I think really synthesizes that those foundational layers to enable songbirds to persist and to choose this place as home rather than to move on. I have other slides here, but I think just out of time and the preciousness of attention, I'm going to stop. But just know that if there are other aspects of this that you want to explore through questions, I'm happy to do so. Kevin, I'll hand this back over to you for whatever Q&A, and anything's good by me. I'll also stop sharing.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Chris. That was really awesome to see you put that all together. I've seen bits and pieces and different presentations and different projects, but putting it all together for this audience, that was very well done. Thank you for sharing that with us. And hopefully people learned a lot and take some of this home with them, or if they work at other organizations, to bring it to them as well. If you notice the chat box, I put, Chris mentioned the NOMO May 3-part series. I put the registration link for the next one, which will happen in March. I also put the recording of the first session, if you're interested in that, in the chat box as well on the Pennypack Trust YouTube page. And if you liked what Chris talked about tonight and you can and are willing to support the Pennypack Trust and their mission and everything you talked about tonight, I also put the link for membership and a one-time donation in the chat box as well. So thank you, Chris, and thank you, the Pennypack Trust, for supporting bird communities the way you are. Chris didn't mention that the Pennypack Trust is the second most popular spot for migrating songbirds in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, which is a really awesome fact to share. It's also where I got my start in birding and why I like Windcote Audubon Society. So I will stop talking. If you can, please support the Pennypack Trust. I also put in the chat box the next presentation for Windcote and a way to support Windcote through the website. So after all that support, let's get to the questions. The first question comes from Nilish. He says, has there been a bird census over the years at PERT that could allow you to see if the growth in grassland acreage has helped?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. I have a disappointing answer for you. I don't, while David Robertson actually is responsible for so much of the data collection that happened here through the establishment period of those grasslands, I know that he would probably be able to point to a cache of data that may be able to demonstrate that. But I don't know that we've ever invested time in analyzing that data to see if there's a direct result, specifically from that grassland. I would David, do you want to take a swing at that?
There weren't any, we didn't do any detailed surveys of the grasslands. We did sort of casual surveys of the grasslands, but we didn't do anything detailed or formal. So there's really no background data to document one way or the other.
And I would imagine it's the birds that we're hosting, even when they're nesting here, they have lives, and ranges that are hundreds, if not thousands of miles long. So I'm not sure that we could demonstrate causality if we saw increases or decreases in populations. Would you agree with that, David?
Yes, I would agree with that. Yep.
Can I just do a quick follow-up? Kevin, is that all right if I just ask a question? Right, so Chris, I understand that the data doesn't exist, but I think the opportunity exists for you to establish a protocol. And there's enough of a community of birders around that you could establish a protocol where we, using some spot counts, et cetera, on I don't know, a biannual basis or a semi-annual basis, you could start to build a database because you've got some very specific habitat and you could pick out some survey points that reflect that habitat. And over time, if you could maintain that program, you would learn, how the bird life is changing, right? Particularly in the two seasons, the breeding, non-breeding season. So anyway, just a thought.
Well, that's a great thought. And in fact, that's what Dr. Robertson had been doing for forest interior nesting birds over a period of 26 years. And that data is fascinating. And as I said, I hope David can unpack that for us because the analysis is pretty awesome. But I would think that we would probably yield better regional data by looking at Christmas bird counts and backyard bird counts and simply looking at changes over time within a very specific region of a packet of data, or I should say a refined geography.
Chris, we did start planning some of that stuff, and we were hoping Windcote Audubon Society would help us out with volunteers once we do get this kind of underway to kind of track exactly that using point counts such as Climate Watch, just like that. But good question. Well, we'll definitely be reaching back out once we get a little bit on our feet, I think. Miriam was the next in line to ask a question. I think she wanted to talk. Now's your time, Miriam Schaefer, if I have it correct. If you want to go on, unmute yourself. I see her. She's trying. Take your time. If you put your mouse on the screen, if you go on the bottom left, there's the mute option. You might want to click that. If you're having trouble with that, you can just type in the chat box and I'll get to your question.
Well, I see the question there. She wrote it
Oh,
out.
she did. Oh, I didn't scroll
Yeah.
down. There we go. I was trying to stay in order. Where is that? Okay. How do you know when you can start disturbing things? For example, my neighbors will attest that my garden beds all look messy because I left the leaf litter down. When is it okay to rake up? The winter aconite are blooming, but they're all buried. So you can start mowing again in June, etc.
Oh man. I'll tell you a little story here. I was under severe pressure by a near neighbor to mow that orchard way before June because he wanted to make sure that that orchard looked quite a bit more kept. It could also be used as an alternative place for horses to graze if the nearby pasture needed to be turned off for a while. And once the seed had set on those grasses, it was going to become a dietary problem for the horses. And so he looked at that landscape and went, what the heck are you guys doing? No, I'm not getting any utility out of this landscape anymore. Even though it is owned by the Pennypack Trust. And then not just that, but staff started to get in there and realize, oh my God, there's these butterflies. And we're starting to see all this complexity emerge. And now there's red-winged blackbird nests. Chris, are you going to make us go in there and kill all that stuff? And, you know, not to put too fine a point on it, the answer is, yep, you got to go in there and kill that stuff. We waited until those fledglings were flying. That's what was happening by July. But at some point you do have to disturb things, and guaranteed every time you disturb things, you're going to kill things or you're going to set them back. There's just no doubt about it. And I'm not going to try and convince you otherwise. We're looking at essentially cohorts of insects in their life cycles where we've got big peaks. Going back to that diagram that showed nectar flow in these two big peaks. Well, can you find a trough in there that is going to be a convenient place where you're not eliminating all of that energy? You're letting the vast majority of it flow through. Keep in mind, we weren't letting any of that flow through before. So everything is uplift. But there's no way in which you can manage a landscape and keep it as a grassland, which is a static landscape. It's no longer progressing as a scrubland. You can't have that without causing death and disruption. That's just part of the game. And one of the things that is going to be really interesting about our next presentation is, well, not many of you have the kinds of powerful mowers and tractors that we have that can knock down grasses that are now 3 feet tall. So what is it that you as a landowner can do with your little tiny Honda 1-stroke 5-horsepower engine? So there's all, and then of course there's code issues. There's how much do your neighbors hate you by now? There's all kinds of factors that need to go into this. So, and I'm not trying to make your neighbors hate you, by the way.
Oh, they hate me anyway. Although it's catching on.
I see that in your comment that things tend to get woolly when you're favoring natives and when you're favoring complexity, and not a lot of people have an eye for that or have any care for it whatsoever. I think there's a whole script of design and design thinking that can help you bridge the gap between ecosystem services and culturally appropriate aesthetics. But again, I spent 15 years trying to crack that nut, and it's different in every single place. So I hear you, but I think the best thing I can say is get comfortable with the fact that you've always been performing disturbance. You've always been mulching that energy. Just let's try and do it in a in a smarter way.
Well, my concern is that, so I left my beds the way they are, and all my neighbors hate me. Although actually, I'm joking. They're actually beginning to understand. But what I'm concerned is if I do it too soon, that all the good that I did all winter is all going to be trashed, or So how do you know?
And the problem with really small landscapes is that you can't diversify it. You can't go in there and mow it. You can't mow half of it and leave another half, right? But there are ways in which that you can collect that leaf litter and put it into a pile somewhere and let those eggs come through. There's ways in which you can cache that kind of energy and micromanage it if that's the level of detail that you want to take on. But again, every single
I'll
place
put
is,
it on the compost heap. Okay, thank
yes.
you.
Thank you, Chris. And I think that exemplifies why I'm so excited about this project is that, like you said, there's the flashy pictures online, but the Pennypack Trust, we're trying to give an honest representation of what this actually looks like. And, realistic expectations for homeowners and large landowners alike. So that's one of my favorite parts about this. It takes work, time, energy, and education. I like to say, leave the pitchforks at home with your neighbors and educate them. It's a growing movement. And as long as we stay honest and positive with our neighbors, it's going to keep catching on and making an impact. So that's one of my favorite parts. We have one more question and then several good comments, but we're going to end with this last question. If you do have any other questions, myself, Chris, we're easily reachable through the Pennypack website and the other resources I shared tonight. So if you have any other questions, we're going to end with this last one. It is from John, and he says, does fire play a part in grasslands? If so, do you plan any controlled burns?
Boy, talk about mortality when it comes to fire. But that is a natural cycle. That is the progenitor of grasslands here in this part of the eastern seaboard and the Piedmont, is that you would have trees drop because they're senescing. You'd have lightning strikes, and a good intense fire is going to get you down to bare soil pretty fast. And it's the grasses and the forbs that are the first to emerge. And it takes, depending on your location and aspect and seed bank and rain, it takes a decade or it takes several decades for that to become scrubland. But fire is the natural way of ensuring that you're going to have grass year after year. That's what's getting rid of the woody materials. It's also ironic. I'm not sure if this is irony or not, but it's also responsible for unlocking the fertility or the fecundity of oaks and other species. A lot of northeastern hardwood forests are fire dependent, but they're not fire dependent in the way that they might be out west or in the plains. They are dependent on fire cycles that are 6 to 20 years before repetition. So fire is absolutely a natural means of grooming your landscape from an ecosystem point of view. However, if we were to start a fire here at the Pennypack Trust, and if that fire were to get even mildly out of hand, we would have lawsuits with near neighbors that would easily get us into the tens of millions of dollars in damages. And bye-bye land trust. In addition to that, we happen to be on the final approach to Northeast Philadelphia, and there's no way the FAA would let us burn our areas here. So I would say primarily the limiting factor is the fact that we have warm season grasses that are 6-9 feet tall, huge amounts of fuel that go up in a hurry when you burn that either in winter or in early spring. And to keep that under control is certainly not something I'm experienced with and that our staff are not qualified to do. Natural lands and the folks responsible for a lot of landscapes that were Duke, am I saying that right? DuPont's. those folks manage cool season grasses and do use fire at Mount Cuba, for instance. But they're doing it in cool season grasses in March when there's very low fuel, and all of them are trained to do it. So I wish we could dabble in it, but it's an intensely risky thing.
Good answer. Thank you, Chris.
I'll say one more thing on that, and that is to say, well, what the hell do you do with grasses that are 9 feet tall and producing tons of biomass that's just standing there on the landscape? And the answer is that it's mown by a farmer who then bales that material and sells it as a biofuel some years, or he will sell it to folks who are interested in sediment traps. The market changes every year. Sometimes it's just mushroom compost, but that biomass is hauled off site. Some of it is laid down and left here, but most of it is hauled off site, particularly when there's a buyer for it. This year, my understanding is that there is no buyer for it. So we're going to see it cut and dried and laid through most of the trust. But we'll have some of it carted off just because it is a bit of a risk. Yeah, but that's why ecological restoration is also ecological gardening. It is a very ham-fisted approach to natural systems.
Thank you, Chris. So I'll just reiterate from all the comments here, what a great presentation. And Pauline Bentley said, I think it was Bentley. Pauline said, wow, made it, must have been good. Thank you. Outstanding presentation from Stephen, extremely informative and well done. Thank you, Chris. Love what you're doing. No mo may. Thank you, Shirley. Last question. And then we'll finish with a comment from Dave Robertson, which I didn't know. Thank you, Dr. David. One good indication that the created warm season grasslands attract grassland nesting birds is the fact that sedge wrens nested in the created warm season grasslands during 2 summers. And they are among Pennsylvania's most finicky grassland and wet meadow nesting birds. Anecdotal evidence, but interesting nonetheless. I didn't know that. Thank you for sharing, Dave. Yeah, there's just so much to learn with this topic, and you can kind of go down different rabbit holes where you're at. But first and foremost, it's about creating the foundation for birds, which starts with, like Chris said, the insects, the soil, the plants, and everything like that. So thank you, Chris, for this great presentation. Thank you, Lee, and the Wingcoat Audubon Society for hosting and getting 48 people to come out from across the United States and 1 person from the UK. So thank you all. Enjoy your Friday night, and happy birding. Thank you.